All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. And my name is Tuey Ramos Fermin, and I am the Director of Programs at the Laundromat Project. And my pronouns are he, him. And for those of you who are new to our community, the LP is a Black-rooted, people of color center arts organization working at the intersection of arts, social justice, and community building. Since 2005, we have advanced artists and neighbors as change agents in their own communities. Thank you for joining us today for the first part of the 5-part series of a 2-day program, the Abolitionist Storywork, Weaving Collective Narratives of Freedom. This evening, we're presenting Naming to Repair, documenting narratives of state violence. On the screen, you'll see a black and white event flyer, the program title, and we'll begin the program with sharing a few access notes. So at the Laundromat Project, we're committed to hosting accessible and inclusive events. Real-time captioning is available for this program. You can turn captions on or off through the closed caption feature. At the bottom of the screen, you can locate that and do that. We'll be recording today's session for archival purposes. The recording may also be available later on our platforms. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, just turn off your camera. Mics will be turned off during the duration of this program. And for that, we also begin each public program with a land acknowledgement. We at the Laundromat Project respectfully acknowledge that our primary location of operations at 1476 Fulton Street, Brooklyn, New York, sits on the occupied and unceded lands of the Canarsie, who are part of the Munsee Lenape. We recognize them as the original stewards of this land and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I invite you to join me in acknowledging the stories of the land where you are currently gathered and pay respect, gratitude to its original stewards. And now for the program. This is a collaboration with our inaugural Radical Imagination Fellow here at the LP. This fellowship is designed to engage the LP staff, board, and larger LP community around new ideas and perspectives. The fellow's role is to deepen our understanding around timely issues of abolition, healing justice, public memory, and the Black radical imagination. It is within this context that today's program came to be, with Piper Anderson as our inaugural Radical Imagination Fellow. Piper has been working with us for 9 months in leading sessions with our community and has organized this series of timely and urgent programs. Piper has been involved in the abolitionist and storytelling work for a very long time, and we are grateful to be in community with her and excited to share these conversations with you. Transforming narratives of punishment demands a reckoning with the past while keeping our feet planted in the direction of the future we want to create. Abolitionist story workers use narrative strategies to reflect on our shared experiences of criminal punishment and state violence as a starting place for building a shared vision for a world free of system of punishments. In this 2-day convening, learn, imagine, dream, and weave stories of abolition alongside practitioners working in oral histories, community archive development, and an interdisciplinary range of narrative justice strategies to create community care, safety, and liberation. For today's program, we're joined by Andrea Ritchie, Interruptingcriminalization, Gabriel Solis from Texas After Violence Project, Sarita Daftary from Freedom Agenda, and moderated by Dylan Brown. You can access bios in the chat that we'll share in a minute. And now I'm very excited to turn it over to Piper. Thank you so much and welcome. Welcome, Piper.
Thank you, Atue. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to thank all of you for joining us this evening for this first Abolitionist Storywork convening, which is the kind of public programming component of my fellowship with the Laundromat Project. I'm really grateful to Kimmy and to the Laundromat Project team for really giving me the freedom to make this this year-long fellowship an opportunity to reflect and to learn and to create space to deepen practice with practitioners that I have admired for 2 decades. Some of the folks on this, and Andrea and I have known each other for 2 decades. You know, so, and to also be able to create space where other practitioners who are also thinking about the role of narrative in their organizing work can come together and be in practice and in community together. I'm gonna pass it off to Dylan Brown, who I'm not gonna embarrass you, really, Dylan. I'm just gonna say that Dylan is one of my former students at NYU that I'm so proud of. Former student, now collaborator, colleague, co-conspirator in the work. And I'll just say of Dylan that he's always sort of, always definitely embodied the kind of commitment to integrity and accountability that is so essential to this work. And so I'm really excited to pass it off to Dylan to moderate this conversation right now. So I hope I didn't embarrass you too much. I just wanted to say I'm really proud of you.
Thank you, Piper. Welcome again, everyone. I'm super excited to be here for our conversation today. My name is Dylan, and I'll really be moderating this conversation. And we're really fortunate and lucky to have Andrea Ritchie, Gabriel Solis, and Sarita Daftary here to discuss their public memory work and how narrative strategies can be used to document and expose state violence committed against targeted communities. So before I go in and introduce our panelists and read their bios, I wanted to let everyone know that we're gonna have a 20-minute Q&A towards the end of today's session. So if you have any questions throughout our conversation, you can drop them in the chat box and then I'll look through them and read some towards the end of today. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists this evening. So Andrea Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant police misconduct attorney and organizer whose writing, litigation, and advocacy has focused on policing and criminalization of women and LGBT people of color for the past 2 decades. She's currently a researcher in residence on race, gender, sexuality, and criminalization at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, where she recently launched the Interrupting Criminalization Research and Action Initiative. She's an author and has published numerous articles, policy reports, and research studies. She is a nationally recognized expert and sought-after commentator on policing issues and works with groups across the country to support campaigns to end profiling, police violence, criminalization, mass incarceration, and deportation. Our second panelist is Gabriel Daniel Solis, who's the executive director of the Texas After Violence Project. Previously, he worked as a post-conviction mitigation specialist for the Office of Capital and Forensic Writs, criminal justice researcher at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, and a coordinator for the Guantanamo Bay Oral History Project at Columbia University. Gabriel's writings have appeared in the Texas Observer, Oxford American, Scallywag, Cultural Dynamics, Insurgent Scholarship on Culture, Politics, and Power, and Kula, Knowledge Creation. And Gabriel is the recipient of the 2018 Pushcart Prize for Nonfiction. And then our third panelist today is Sarita Daftary, who is an organizer with over 15 years of experience supporting people and communities to exercise self-determination. Her experience includes previous roles as the coordinator for the East New York Oral History Project, a senior community organizer with Just Leadership USA, was director of Greenlight District at El Puente in Williamsburg, and East New York Farms project director at United Community Centers. And currently, she works as co-director of Freedom Agenda, and Sarita has been among a group of core partners working on the Rikers Public Memory Project. So thank you all their panelists for donating their time and being here on a Thursday evening. And without further ado, just really want to jump into our conversation. So just to open things up, could each of you share a little bit about kind of what narrative work you do and what brought you into this work? Anyone can feel free to start.
I'm happy to start. Thank you, Dylan, so much, and thank you, Piper, and to the Laundromat Project for inviting me. I'm happy to participate in this. I'd also want to say at the front, my daughter is right outside in the other room and being very loud, so you may hear her in the background. So I will, I'll talk more about Texas after violence as we go on with this, but I actually got my start pretty young doing this work at this organization as an intern way back when I was an undergraduate student. And I tell our interns that too, because it's kind of interesting how that one internship opportunity as a young person really set me on the trajectory that I have been on ever since then. And at that time, the organization was focused on doing oral histories of people who've been impacted by murder and the death penalty. And so we were a small organization, and we had a little camera, and we traveled around the state documenting really, really emotionally intense, but also important narratives that the public needed to know more about beyond what we were being told about the need for capital punishment in Texas at that time. And so that's how I got my start. And actually, interestingly, the story work, I kept it with me and used it in different contexts. So even outside of a oral history project or an archival project, even doing post-conviction mitigation investigation, the story work was still pretty strong there. I mean, the goal there was to tell the story of the person who'd been given a death sentence. This was post-conviction, so we were working on their state level appeal. And the key there was to tell the story that the jury never heard at the trial level for a lot of reasons, mostly because public defenders didn't have the resources that they needed to do a full-on biosocial psycho investigation of the client and their social history, their family history, going back several generations, et cetera. So at the post-conviction level, we had slightly more resources to do that. And I would go into communities and try to build trust and understanding and authentic relationships with our clients' family and friends and ex-boyfriends and ex-girlfriends and ex-teachers and anyone who would talk to us, basically, and try to weave together the full story for the judge to hear, to convince them that nobody, no matter what they may have done, deserves to be executed. And so the story work persisted throughout, different ways that I've interacted with the criminal punishment system. And then just to wrap up, I'll talk much more about what we're doing now, but I came back to TAVP in 2016 and am so proud of the way that we've expanded our mission, multiple incredible projects happening right now. And I'm just very committed and dedicated to this kind of work, and happy to be here with you all talking about it. So thanks for the question, Dylan.
Sarita or Andrea, could either of you respond when what brought you to this work?
Looks like we're playing chicken, so yeah. I guess you win, Sarita. I'm Andrea. I go by she and her. I'm fine with any pronoun. I'm wondering if my internet is chopping up.
You're still good. We can still hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry, I'm coming to you all from the middle of a storm somewhere, so that's part of the reason. Also coming to you all from occupied Oneida territory of the Haudenosaunee people. And I'm a light-skinned, very light-skinned Black woman with square blue glasses, blue eyes, curly hair, wearing a black shirt. And I'm sitting in the office of a writing residency, so it's chaos behind me, and I'm struggling with this computer. So that's who I am. I came to this work by documenting police violence and resistance involving Black women, girls, trans and gender nonconforming people, both as someone who had been organizing around police violence kind of between Rodney King and Amadou Diallo, and noticing that no one was talking about women who were being killed or harmed under very similar circumstances at the same time, where I was living and across the US. And also as someone who was engaged in anti-violence work, and as Dylan said, I come to this work as a Black woman, a lesbian, an immigrant to the US, but also as a survivor of state and interpersonal violence myself. And I was working with other survivors of sexual violence, looking at how police were responding to sexual violence investigations. And the story, of course, that came out was that cops were perpetrating sexual violence and not protecting anyone from it, which had been my experience, but I thought it was just something bad that happened to me, and I didn't understand how systemic it was. And so once, sort of from those two places of work, really just started kind of obsessively documenting every story I could find of police, Black women, girls, queer and trans people. And as Piper mentioned, she was one of the first people I collaborated with to engage in abolitionist storytelling as part of a kind of human rights documentation project around police violence against queer and trans people, particularly talking about not only experiences of police violence, but experiences of lack of protection, and then dreaming together to tell a story about what safety would look like. And so it was not just stories of subjection, but stories of resistance too, which has also been pretty invisibilized and hidden. That, sometimes people say things like, Black women, no one shows up for Black women when they're killed by police. And it's like, actually, Black women consistently show up for Black women when they're killed by police and hurt by police. So there's like a resistance that's invisibilized also. And so try and tell that story as well. And then, a little bit like Gabrielle, I've had to try and make those stories legible to the court, which is often a problem, and to in police misconduct litigation, to legislators and policymakers, and help folks understand through stories why abolition is actually the way to produce safety for the people police claim to protect. So it's a little bit about how I came to this work. Thanks.
Thank you.
Now there's no one else to call on, and I was vacillating between the urge to stall or to go get it over with, but it was, really, I'm really grateful to be in this conversation, and I'm sort of distracted by how interested I am to hear from the other panelists, so I'll try to be focused when it's my turn to share. But my name is Sarita Daftary. I am a co-director of Freedom Agenda. We're a membership-led organization, actually a project under the umbrella of the Urban Justice Center, but led by our members and my co-directors, who are people who have been incarcerated, been directly impacted by the incarceration of someone close to them, and are working towards decarcerating New York City and transforming our systems of safety here. And as I guess Dylan touched on in our bios, I come to this work from doing a lot of neighborhood level organizing work that I think often is in the work I do now is sort of the description of what we would say is actually safety. Organizing folks who are developing community gardens or creating, cultural events that bring together young people and elders. And I have always really enjoyed doing that work, and doing that work gives you a real front row seat to how undervalued and underappreciated that work is, while so many resources are poured into criminalization. So I spent a lot of time doing that, and through that it was through that experience that I really became close to people who were harassed by police every day in their neighborhood, who were, I can actually think of one young person who I worked with who, her father was serving a life sentence at the same time that her mother was working as a correction officer on Rikers Island, and had to take mental health leave because of the conditions there, the environment there. And we could go into a lot more detail around that. But sort of in the process of doing the work with community members to build up safety and community, always saw the ways that the carceral system was tearing that down, and so was interested in working on this side of things for a while, to dismantle the things that aren't working. And I always sort of through those different types of work, I would say, was always work was always really focused on self-determination. So if it was, developing community gardens or supporting community gardens in East New York, it was because people had already really been doing that, and people had like skill and energy and excitement for that. And it was just sort of figuring out what we could do to support that and build on it. And help people sort of make decisions about what mattered in their community. And I think, mass incarceration is a pretty extreme offense to self-determination, both as, as an individual and as communities. But I was also always really interested in like, what are the deeper stories that we've been sold that are, or the myths that we've been sold, and how have people absorbed those? And when I was working at East New York Farms, we were working with folks who had developed community gardens from all this abandoned land. And I started working there when I was right out of college. So I would say my most substantial education happened there more so than in college. And the obvious question is sort of like, well, why was there so much abandoned land? And I have to say, maybe this could be chalked up to my course selections, but I majored in sociology at Georgetown, and I did not really learn anything substantial about redlining unless I missed it, like until I was learning that from community gardeners in East New York, and thinking of that as, something that's such an important, another form of state violence that has shaped, communities and opportunities for people today. It was really striking what I didn't know about that, and then really striking to talk with the young people that we were working with. I ran a youth internship program there, and understanding that without having the story about what actually happened, or in some cases having the wrong story about what happened, young people had absorbed some ideas about, like if you sort of scratched a little bit below the surface, you would realize that they sort of felt like, well, white people probably did something right, and our people, Black and brown people, probably did something wrong. Like there's something that describes why our community is struggling, and those communities, across the river or a few miles away are flourishing, and like didn't have the story to fully understand that wasn't how it happened. It was not individual choices, and how that was systemic. And then, actually got a chance there to do some story work with like young people interviewing elders, and then built on that when I, after that, to work on an oral history project about East New York, where I interviewed people who lived in East New York in the 60s, and really sort of saw the period of drastic transition, both in terms of racial demographics, but also in terms of services and divestment, disinvestment, and the impacts that had. So now with Freedom Agenda and the Rikers Public Memory Project, I would say that a lot of Freedom Agenda's work, and especially in the past few weeks, I mean, anybody who has been following news around New York City might know that there's a horrific epidemic of deaths on Rikers Island right now. And so a lot of our work as Freedom Agenda lives in the very like fast-paced world of policy organizing and sometimes rapid response, and that's important, and we do it for a reason, because people are dying, people are being subjected to torture, and also I've been really glad for our ability to be part of the Rikers Public Memory Project, and I've seen the way that our members value that as well, because at the same time, like we're very aware that there's a longer term project of shifting the stories that we have about safety and about our communities' histories, and we won't. We have to make sure that we're doing both at the same time, because without that, our wins will not be durable. So I'll end there. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Thank you all for those thoughtful reflections and sharing what brought you to this work. I think actually, Sarita, you gave a perfect transition in thinking about public memory work or specifically oral history work where violence is continuously unfolding, and specifically carceral violence. So my next question for all the panelists is, how do you approach this type of public memory work when the violence is continuously ongoing, and how do you like navigate the challenges that come with that? And then actually, Sarita, if we could start with you, and maybe also specifically thinking within the context of Rikers Island, and just even as you already alluded to earlier, like the current the existence of Rikers Island in and of itself is a crisis. But specifically in this moment where since December of 2020, 12 people have died while imprisoned on Rikers. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about challenges of like doing public memory work in a situation where the violence of Rikers is continuously unfolding.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is challenging because it's not past. And so, you know, and I guess, you know, that's the case for a lot of harms that we're documenting, like, you know, they're still present and sometimes in a different form, but it's, you know, there's a lot of immediate need to address the current bad and the future bad. And so I think it can be challenging to figure out like making space to sort of look back. But at the same time, those harms are continuing in a lot of ways because we haven't shifted the story that people have. And so, you know, sort of like just constantly navigating, like how do we make time for that, that deeper level of work. And one thing that's, you know, really particular about story is that there's been such a massive and coordinated backlash against decarceration that has been, you know, really orchestrated by police and law enforcement, and, you know, aided and abetted by media. And they've been so successful in that it hurts my heart to say this, but the mayor has chosen to let people die, and not just the mayor, but like elected officials broadly are sort of like, I'm sorry, this is like very raw for me, so I'm gonna have to like sort of think about how this comes out, but they're essentially like, yes, it's unfortunate that people are dying, but if we let people out, the police commissioner will say bad things, and so like we're just gonna let people die. Like that is what is happening at this moment. And so for us, like that's been really caused us to think about like, what do we need to do like to inoculate people against that police propaganda, against that law enforcement propaganda, because they're going to do it, but like, what do we need to do so that it has no effect? And I think that's, you know, the work that the other panelists are doing, and that a lot of people are doing. But it's hard. And I think that the other thing that we're struggling against is like, we want to do, and a lot of times in the Rikers Public Memory Project, we've talked about documenting the legacy of Rikers and the harms of Rikers in order to build our case for repair. But I think that building that case for repair is pretty difficult when the powers that be are still using those harmful narratives to justify what they're doing now. Like they can't admit that they never should have done it because they're still doing it. And so those are, yeah, some of the challenges that we're looking at and thinking through.
Thank you. Andrea and Gabriel, just to also reframe the question for the context and work that you all do, how do you guys navigate the challenges that come from like documenting violence and really like a past that is not yet passed? And how do you support both like participants in that and sharing their story, and then also for yourselves, like care for yourselves in that process as well?
I mean, I think that last part of the question is something I had to like come to after 20 years of documenting stories, is just the rawness that you're talking about, Sarita, that it's happening, it continues to happen. I often kind of burst into tears when I like confuse names or can't remember names because there's so many names and I'm holding so many stories and names in my head. And, you know, when I was writing Invisible No More, I had cut, like the book was like 500 pages long or whatever. It was just so many stories, and already reading it is a challenge. Like people are like, whoa, this is a lot of stories of police violence and it's really hard to read. And I had to cut a bunch, and I couldn't bear to cut them because I was like, if I cut them, then are they lost to everyone but the people they happen to and the people who did the violence, right? Who have probably forgotten it. And so I created this database on this book website just to hold those stories. I think there's a challenge I personally face is how to hold those stories and how to hold them with care and complexity and staying connected to the humanity of the people that they happen to individually and collectively, that, you know, each of them is a whole human with a whole world of people who love them and care for them and a whole perspective on their lives that's like more than the moment of violation, and trying to reflect that, and then also trying to hold that in a way that also holds like how much of it there is. I think for the folks whose experiences I document, the challenge is also that there's invisibility and often very little information, right? So I'm kind of having to flesh out a story to create that humanity and that connection out of nothing. And, you know, Saidiya Hartman and Sarah Haley write really powerfully about how they had to do that for people when the harm is in the past, and they're literally like looking at one line and trying to breathe into that, the life of the person that was taken or harmed or whatever, and just really kind of writing as a revolutionary act in that situation, which I really try and live up to. And then I think the other piece that is really challenging is undermining the criminalizing narratives in the story, right? So one that just came to mind as you were speaking, Sarita, is of Ma'Khia Bryant, right, who was killed as the verdict in the George Floyd murder trial was being handed down. And the story that was immediately told about her was about, you know, her violence. And the story that was not told about her was the violence that she was defending herself against, experiencing, the violence that she experienced over the course of her life, the violence her mom and community and grandmother and everyone experienced at the hands of many systems. And I think sometimes the challenge is also like, yeah, is what you're saying, like fighting the ways in which the story is told to justify the violence. And also, yeah, trying to push against the stories that tell us that the only police violence worth talking about is police violence against unarmed people or against cisgender Black men who are assumed to be heterosexual, or it takes place in public, that's videotaped on the street, that takes place at the hands of, you know, armed uniformed police officers as opposed to caseworkers or ICE agents or border patrol, or, you know, that there's so many ways that, or teachers or school administrators or doctors or, you know, EMTs, you know, often people who are being offered as alternative to police are also policing people and committing violence. And so how do we tell those stories completely so that we can come to more complete solutions that don't just have us substitute one kind of violence for another? And I think, or that have us cast some people out of the conversation because, you know, we're falling for the blame game and the self-blame game, right? And so those are just a few of the many challenges I struggle with.
Yeah, and I have several thoughts. I'll try to be brief. The first is that, you know, we are a small nonprofit organization. We are not affiliated with a larger institution, and we have modest funding. And so but we're still constantly trying to respond to everything happening, and that's very difficult to do. I mean, even today, the team was sort of going back and forth about whether we had the capacity to take on yet another project. I was suggesting that we try to get police records and go through them and see what stories the records tell us about the inner workings of state violence and building storytelling projects around that. But, you know, for example, last year, we were planning one project, and then when COVID hit, we immediately saw what was happening in jails and prisons and in detention centers, and essentially stopped everything we were doing to plan our sheltering justice project, recognizing, as Sarita was saying, that elected officials in that context were also letting people die, including staff. This is before the vaccine. This is the very, very early days of the pandemic. And so we tried to work closely with our allies and friends who worked in different, as organizers and advocates, journalists, writers, artists, to put together this project. And we did it relatively quickly and have built an archive of materials and stories about COVID in prisons. You know, the landscape of community resistance against state violence is constantly in flux. It's constantly changing because of all the crises that are happening almost daily, it seems. And so another way that we've tried to stay on top of it, also recognizing our own limitations as either a small organization, as parents, as people who are trying to take care of themselves while doing the work, is to bring in people with direct lived experience to help guide our work. So, not just sort of here and there, but really trying to build them into our work at every step of the process. So we've just in the last few weeks put out a call for a community advisor to come in and even sit in on our team meetings and give us guidance. We have our Visions After Violence Fellowship that we just released yesterday for directly impacted people to build memory projects and archival collections around our issue areas. And so we're just constantly trying to respond to the needs that we're seeing in our own communities. And, in addition to the memory work that we do, we also have, for example, another project that is urgently trying to train mental health clinicians to be better prepared to welcome people who've been impacted by the death penalty into their care. We recognize that a lot of clinicians didn't have that experience, the training to work with somebody who may have lost a loved one to execution or may have a loved one facing execution. And so we put out a report, and then just today our access to treatment coordinator Susanna Sheffer held a training for mental health clinicians to better prepare them to work with this very underserved population. So even as a small organization, we're really trying to do all these different things as best we can. But I think that's where partnerships and collaborations and discussions like this are actually really essential for us, because we can say, here's another group doing this thing really well. How can we support them, and vice versa?
Amazing. Thank you. So one of the reasons we're all gathered here today is to think specifically about abolitionist story work and how abolitionist story work is distinctive and unique. So a question for all of you is, what does an abolitionist approach to storytelling require? And how does it differ from other oral history and narrative strategies and projects?
I mean, I think for me, again, it's sort of challenging criminalizations in the stories we hear, or the ones that form the propaganda that you were talking about, Sarita. And, Mariam Kaba and I are working on a book right now called No More Police, A Case for Abolition. And we've been really thinking about this question and thinking about I don't know if this is still true, but when we were growing up, everyone had to read a book called The Lord of the Flies. And it was about, do you also have to read that? It's like about a group of boys who wind up on an island and, mayhem ensues, right? That's actually propaganda, because there's other stories, real stories of, for instance, 15 and 16-year-old, a group of 15 and 16-year-old Tongan youth who actually wound up shipwrecked on an island, spent 18 months there, survived through cooperation, mutual support, creative conflict resolution, and spirituality, play, and a whole bunch of other things that could be stories that would tell us we don't need police in order to stop mayhem and chaos from ensuing. But that's not the story we all had to read. We all had to read the story that tells us this is the world that will exist if there isn't cops. So I feel like for me, it's like also looking for the stories that you were saying, Sarita, like are in the culture and infusing, like that's the shift we have to make. I hear sometimes people like retelling the Goldilocks story. I really love that. People are like, so this white chick breaks into people's houses, takes their stuff, and they tell it in the way that it would be told if it was, a young Black child and, a white people's home, and not a young white girl and some bears, right? And then they list off like all the felonies she committed and like all the, right? Burglary, trespass, robbery, like not robbery, I guess, maybe because they didn't come back, whatever. But it's like, oh, or people like have challenged me on like the reading of The Lion King. It's like Mufasa's the colonial power, like the Scar is the resistance, right? Like that, but they're all framed as like dark and evil, and it's complicated because then they kind of make them into Nazis. But I think it's like starting to look in at like how the stories that are deeply in our culture point us to prisons and punishment and policing and surveillance as necessary for our safety, and which ones point us to other ways of thinking about the world. And so like reading, I've just read a new book coming out from Monica Byrne called The Actual Star, that sort of talks about a way of living that doesn't involve policing, but maybe it does. Like, and it's just about imagining like what could point us to different ways of being. I really look at visionary fiction, Octavia's Brood, all these kinds of visionary ways of imagining worlds and being like, does this point us in the direction of policing? Does this, and or away from policing and into an abolitionist future? And there's so many ways of looking for that. So I think just looking at the stories that inform how we think is maybe part of like getting at that root. And then, you know, in terms of oral history collection and storytelling in the work, it's about looking for one, stories that help us complete our understanding of where and how and why policing and punishment happen. And I think that for us at Interrupting Criminalization, like we understand that looking at women's and queer and trans people's experiences of policing get us more quickly to abolition, because they show us all the ways that policing happens, and they also really break open this illusion of police as protectors, right? And that they're actually stopping any kind of violence, and shows us how much violence they're perpetrating, even in the context of calls for help, even when they're answering a welfare check and then killing a woman who's sitting there with her nephew playing video games, right? So so there's a way in which we want to tell those stories so that we can see kind of the way that policing pervades medical care, pervades social services, pervades family regulation systems, pervades so much of our world, so that we can then start to pull it out and uproot it. And then we also look for stories in our own lives and with the people that we're organizing with that show us how people are confronting, preventing, transforming, holding people accountable for violence and harm and conflict and need that are different, that don't involve cops. And I think that's oral histories of elders. I mean, whenever I'm talking to elders, I'm like, so when stuff went down, how y'all handle it? Sometimes their answers are transformative, sometimes they're not. But you know, or anywhere I am, I'm like, well, what do you all do here when this happens or that happens? If you're in a rural area, if I'm in another country, if I'm in another part of the country. And so I think looking for that. And I think the storytelling and organizing project that Rachel Hertzing, formerly of Critical Resistance and Creative Interventions, is like a good example of like just going around and asking people, like, have you experienced violence in your life? How did you address it? And learning from that. And BYP 100 recently kind of did a similar thing through their She's Safe, We Safe campaign. And I know the National Black Women's Justice Initiative is doing that as well. So I feel like there's so many ways that we can look to stories around us, and also practice new stories and then tell those. So those are some of the ways I see abolitionist storytelling helping us crack that imagination block that cops in our heads have, and carcerality infecting our brain has created, and then and pointing us to new worlds.
Maybe I'll jump in after, so that all the thoughts that were brewing as you were talking, Andrea, don't leave my head. But I mean, the things that were coming to mind for me actually were stories that I heard from people that, you know, that create an abolitionist vision. And so I actually don't know that I have a great answer about like an abolitionist approach to storytelling, but maybe it's more that my experience is like, if you sort of are deeply curious and you ask people open-ended questions and you let them talk, like they will describe stories that, you know, that in an abolitionist framework. So two things that I'm thinking of, I'll start with the Rikers Public Memory Project, is actually that, I mean, of course, the vast majority of stories from Rikers are terrible. I mean, people suffer immeasurable harm there, but people also, in the interviews that the Rikers Public Memory Project has been collecting, people talk about how they got through it, and they got through it with other people. And actually, there's one mini documentary that some interns for the Rikers Public Memory Project created that I can't remember what the title of it is at this moment, but maybe we can share it after. But just like, you know, the having all those narratives strung together in one piece, also just creating this picture of like what people can do to support each other and protect each other, even in like the most difficult of circumstances, like the circumstances most set up to create a like predator versus prey environment. I do have to say that in that, it is notable. I mean, you see how like Lord of the Flies was about young men, right? And it was notable in those stories that women were more likely to describe that they were able to sort of get past that like that tense environment in jail and build community and build connections. And I think that there's just a lot to look into and a lot to think about in how men have been trained to believe they like can't do that with other men. But another example that comes to mind for me from the interviews that I did with the East New York Oral History Project was that people described to me an experience of like pre-1960s, pre-1970s East New York, where, you know, police were sort of an afterthought, but also interestingly, like structured programming for young people was also sort of an afterthought. And that really challenged me to think, because I spent years like doing work with young people and feeling like having those positive outlets and containers and, you know, community spaces for young people is super important. And also, it was just really striking to hear people describe a possibility where like young people didn't have to like be involved in something all the time, because they could be just like hanging out on the street and not criminalized. And I think that just like kind of broke my brain a little bit, and, you know, sort of reminded me how we need to think about like, you know, challenge ourselves to look deeper into like, well, maybe young people could just hang out on the street and it wouldn't be, it doesn't need to be viewed as a problem. And in fact, you know, they could sort of hang out and do whatever things they were doing before policing became this, you know, this occupying force in Black and Brown communities. And I say that, I should qualify that by saying I'm sure that policing has always been experienced in a lot of ways as an occupying force in Black and Brown communities, but there was definitely a notable shift that people described to me. And I think that one of the most like sinister things about what I heard from people that I think was like really important to interrogate with those interviews too, was that people tended to describe people who lived in East New York before 1960 and then still live in East New York and sort of experienced, you know, a really terrifying wave of violence. I mean, at a point, East New York had the highest murder rate in New York City. It was described as like the killing fields and, you know, an unacceptable level of violence that people had to live with. But people, I think that the propaganda of that time like really trained people to fear their own neighbors. And so people would sort of describe to me how safe the community was when everyone knew each other and they were all out on their stoops and everyone was like, you know, just sort of present in the community all the time. And then they would describe to me that was what they thought would create more safety again. But then they would simultaneously say like, but nobody does that anymore. You know, nobody goes out and talks to their neighbors. Like, I'm kind of scared to do that now. And this is, you know, including a lot of people who are older. And so that seemed like a really important, you know, just to reiterate, I guess that you could often find the anecdote, like, or the antidote is what I should have said, like in another part of the story. So that I've really been really grateful to be able to hear those stories from people.
You know, I think one clear way that sort of abolitionist approach to story work or oral history is different than, you know, more traditional forms of oral history is that the ushering the materials and the stories through to an archive is really at the beginning of the spectrum of the work to be done. It's not the end. And the, you know, building an archive of materials is so crucial, not just for preservation, but for accessibility. of the materials as well. And so when I say archives, I'm thinking of fully accessible, not behind closed doors where you have to have a research pass and all this stuff. These are not the archives we're talking about here. But the preservation piece is so essential because these stories and these materials are endangered. It's something I've talked about quite a bit, is how endangered these stories are, sometimes because people just can't bear to tell them. They can't bear to revisit the trauma. And so we have to sort of recognize that and be okay with stepping back and balancing the urge to document as much as we can, with the recognition that some people just can't do it, and it might be a while before they can do it. So I often frame our work as we are building an archive about violence, but it's an archive of survival, and that's not just in terms of survivors, people who have survived state violence or may have lost a loved one to state violence. But really the way this is, I think, something that Andrea said that I wrote down, how they're not just stories of subjection, but of resistance that's been invisibilized. That's totally true with a lot of the stories that we've documented and archived over the years. It's the way that people somehow go on after losing a son to or a daughter to police, or to an in custody death, or incarceration or execution. And so, another way that I like to describe our work is as basically a network of solidarity among survivors. So when we've asked people, why is it that you open up your homes, pre-COVID when we would do interviews in people's homes, or why are you letting us in and sharing like the most difficult experience of your life with essentially strangers, with a camera and a light and microphones. And I've heard people tell us that they want to help other people who are experiencing something similar, or they want to prevent it from happening to other families. And that is really what it's about. That's the survival piece that I tend to hold on to as well. So I don't know if that's completely answering your question, Dylan, but much more to say about all of that, of course. But I like this idea of again, reframing archives of violence as archives of survival. It's not just about the loss, but also the survival as well.
Thank you. And actually, Gabriel, I was hoping you could expand on that a little more, thinking about like archives of survival or archives of resistance within the context of your organization's Life and Death in a Carceral State project, and talk a little bit about kind of the origins of that project and how it relates to this overarching mission and goals that you outlined previously.
So that is sort of our umbrella project that holds all of our various oral history, documentation, archival projects that we've done over the years. So for example, we did a collaboration with the Texas Justice Initiative several years ago, where they're a data-driven initiative and they track in custody deaths. And so we worked closely with them and identified some issues that we wanted to document some stories around. So some of those issues were, not surprisingly, police shootings. There was pregnancy and women giving birth while incarcerated, and suicides in Harris County Jail in Houston. So these are areas where the data was essentially pulling up red flags, and we wanted to do some storytelling work around that. We also did a really great collaboration with Texas Advocates for Justice, where we essentially stepped to the side and let formerly incarcerated advocates take the lead on the project as interviewers, running the camera and audio equipment, doing a lot of the post-production work, and then activating those materials for whatever purposes that they wanted to activate those stories for their own advocacy. And then also, as I mentioned before, our Sheltering Justice project that we're working on now around COVID and prisons. But yeah, just to emphasize that the subtitle to that project is Loss and Survival. And I keep going back to that piece over and over again, because it's a way for us to see all of the ways that again, like people find ways to survive after they've lost a loved one to state violence. Sometimes that they become investigators trying to investigate to find the truth of what happened. There's this incredible family that we did some interviewing with a couple of years ago, where their brother, their loved one, a young Black man, went into the Harris County Jail, and he died, and the jail administrator categorized it as a suicide. His family just 100% rejects that narrative. And so they've become investigators, they've become spokespeople, they've become media activists, trying to get answers about what happened to their loved one. And so just all of the different ways that incredibly strong people find ways to go on. So that's, yeah, like I said, that's sort of our umbrella documentation and archival project. Everything sort of fits under there. And then we sort of branch off depending on again, just trying desperately to respond to whatever it is that we feel like we can take on.
Awesome, thank you. And then shifting to your work, Andrea, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about Interruptingcriminalization. Just over this past year, it's an amazing resource. I think everyone should check it out online, but there's been zines, reports, guides, and so many wonderful like educational, but then also organizing resources and materials. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why it's important to have a robust ecosystem of abolitionist propaganda, and then also just to combat what you were talking about of uprooting propaganda, why that's important in movement as well.
I mean, I think I just dropped the link to the site in the chat. I mean, for the reasons that you just said, right, and that we've been talking about, which is like the opposing narrative is so deeply embedded in our minds and in the conversation that we need to give people on the ground tools to speak to their neighbors, to speak to their council members, to speak to their mayors to the extent that they're listening, which that one is not, and to challenge their own thinking, right? So, we put out something called Cops Don't Stop Violence when the cops started this, or, amped up their usual, backlash, when their legitimacy is challenged, they reach for their most reliable weapon, which is fear, and they just gin it up, right? And I think part of what I was thinking earlier when we were talking to Sarita is that we have to figure out how to talk to people. And I think we have to figure out how to talk to them also at an emotional level. Because I think that like I can write a really great talking point and back it up with all this data and research. And we're talking about people's core need for safety. Like that's a core need, like beyond sometimes like food, right? Or whatever. So I think it's figure out how to speak to people's emotions, but we're trying to find ways to also give people like talking points and tools and ways of surfacing those things, right? What are you really scared about? Like, what are you scared about your neighbors? Is there something we can do to build community with you that would reduce that fear? Like, like really get people around that. So yeah, we've created, Cops Don't Stop Violence, but also an interactive website called What About the Rapists? Like, what about them? What, like the cops are the rapists is one answer to that question. Most people who experience sexual violence don't call the police is another answer to that question. Like there's so many ways of talking about it, but it's sort of like an interactive website that kind of walks people through that conversation for themselves and then with their neighbors. So it just feels like we also have to disrupt the stories that like policing has always existed, it must exist, it produces safety, we just have to tinker with it here or there, that policing only happens in the streets, it's only the actual cops, that, to caution also about the ways that policing seeps back into other alternatives that we might think about. So we just put out a report on non-police mental health crisis responses to be like, are they really non-police? And are they pushing people into policing and punishment and control in new forms through medical, involuntary confinement, et cetera. So, and then we know that people learn in different ways. Like I read, so I write, but most people actually don't read long ass reports. So we had a couple of visual stuff with like video toolkits, checklists, cartoons, like all kinds of zines, just lots of ways of thinking about things. It's because we're going to need all of that to really break the hold that policing and prisons have on our imagination, and to kind of keep assessing the things that we're trying and building and experimenting with to see how they're working. So the one other thing I'll want to point people to is millionexperiments.com, which is also just about stories of people trying different things. I think that's the thing, is that like people think we have to have the answer before we can move away from this? And it's like, first of all, this has gotten $100 billion a year for decades, and our experiments have not. And so, like, we don't have to prove anything. They're the ones who have to prove why they keep failing and why we keep throwing more money at them and they keep failing. And then secondly, how can we kind of create tools that spark people and encourage people to kind of try something different, and then see how it goes, and then tell someone, and then go to the next thing, and not kind of be sort of worried that we have to have the perfect cookie cutter program that can be replicated across the country. And so that's why we need lots of things, because we need a million things instead of what we have right now. Like, we're not going to replace cops with one thing, we're going to replace with a million things. And so that's why we have a lot of stuff for you to read. Plus, Mariam and I just really like to make things. So that's why there's lots of stuff.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you. I think another thing that you all kind of like also touched on is also just the role of like propaganda, but there are also really like state narratives that we've been fed really like since childhood, since high school, reading Lord of the Flies, like Andrea mentioned earlier. So I was curious, in your work and within your own context, how do you resist even more, especially when we're talking about formerly incarcerated people, creating categories of people who are like deserving and undeserving, and really trying to resist and transcend that binary in your work? And a kind of accompanying question with that is, when you're engaging in storytelling work, oral history work, are there concerns about like co-optation through that process that you take into account? And if so, like, how do you resist them?
Can I just say one thing about that quickly, and then I'll stop talking because I want to hear from other folks. But I think, I was a co-author of the Say Her Name report and have been involved in that campaign. And I think that's been really co-opted to the point where Kamala Harris can like say Sandra Bland's name and then promote a million policies that would kill her a million different ways. And those two things can live in the same moment, because sometimes if we stop at the story and the visibility and we don't push past that to what the story means for what we have to do and how we have to reimagine things completely in order to build a world where Sandra Bland would still be here, where Breonna Taylor would still be here, where Ma'Khia Bryant would still be here, then we've lost. Then I've just cataloged more violence, and maybe I've cataloged more resistance, but we haven't actually changed the conditions that produced any of it. And that's, I think, for me, the challenge around co-optation, is that people might take the story, but they're not going to take the action that's required by the story to prevent the next story. And that's where we have to push back.
Yeah, Sarita, Gabriel, I know it's a loaded question, so I want to give you some time to like think and reflect.
Dylan, I'm actually trying to remember the first part of your question, if you could repeat it, because I thought I had some thoughts on it and then started
Yeah, so the first part of the question is thinking about how do you resist creating categories of deserving and undeserving narrative work?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's probably similar to the way you resist that overall, but it's just something that has been really present for our work as Freedom Agenda, because I think what we realized, although we didn't specifically set out to build our membership this way, but it turns out that a lot of the people who feel most compelled to become part of a membership organization that is completely focused on decarceration and devote their time to that are people who've been most impacted by that, not just the folks who like served a short time for maybe a lower level charge, but people who served really long sentences for really, who faced really serious charges, and in some cases like did some actual serious harm. And I think that has just really, I mean, for me personally, really shifted. Like there's like no conversation that we as like Freedom Agenda can have about like just the nonviolent offender. It's like it would be completely irrelevant to our membership. And so I think that that's, that's really important. And the other piece that you asked, which was about, co-optation. I mean, I think that what comes to mind for me is actually sort of a way that we think about this in our organizing work as well, which is that there's a real role for story work, and sometimes like being able to tell your story is a release for people, and it's sort of like the most they can get to at that moment. To have to add on to that, like, and giving analysis, sort of layering analysis on top of that can be really hard for people. Like I've had enough learning from people to understand that sometimes like they really do just want to tell their story, and like that has to be respected, and there's a really important role for that. But in our organizing work, like what happens more often is that people they're talking about their story, but they are also giving their analysis of like, this is what needs to happen now. And I think that like recognizing that people can have both is really important, because I remember actually going to this city council hearing, and like several of our members, like, just like these really pointed testimonies that they delivered about like exactly what, their own experience and what needed to happen because of that. And I was so mad when one of the commissioners said, she said to one of our members, like, oh, thank you for your story. And actually like he turned to me and said like, no, that wasn't just my story, that was my analysis. So I think that that's part of like, avoiding the co-optation, is to be clear that people can, when they want to, can really deliver both, and should be given that respect and space.
I'll just briefly add to that, that this, this is something that the first director of Texas After Violence, when I was an intern way a long time ago as an undergrad student, this is something she talked about a lot, about the problem of innocence, or, focusing just on people who are perceived to be innocent. And then all these years later, I just put out an essay a couple weeks ago called Resisting the Allure of Innocence. And it was about images of children at the border and how those rupture narratives fairly easily. And I'm glad that they do, because it gets people to pay attention to the horrors happening at the southern border. But basically what I was trying to say is, let's not just get caught up on the allure of innocence. Let's think about everybody, and how white supremacist violence, state violence manifests across the spectrum, across the country, to a lot of different kinds of people, not just innocent children. So that was a point that I was trying to make in that essay. I also point to our writer in residence right now named Jorge Antonio Renaud, who writes about this very thing pretty effectively. He's a formerly incarcerated advocate, now leading the organizing and policy work of Latino justice. A very close friend of mine, has been a big inspiration for our organization over the last 11 or so years that I've known him, and he writes about this. So I would encourage folks to look at what he's talking about. And the last thing I'll just say is, people, no matter what they've done, deserving, undeserving, as we're talking about, they've been, we've abandoned them as a society. People who are treated like objects by state violence, by being incarcerated, by being disenfranchised educationally, economically, politically. And there's this really great book. It's a little academic, but it's called Ethical Loneliness by Jill Stauffer, and she writes a little bit about this. And I, talking about how survivors seek release from this ethical loneliness, or this abandonment, the way that they've been abandoned. And so I go back to that quite a bit. The subtitle of that book is The Injustice of Not Being Heard. And so it's very much relevant, I think, to our work and to this conversation that we're having here. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your remarks. And so I think now we're just going to shift into Q&A, because we do have some questions from folks in the audience that they want to ask. So one of the first questions we have is, how do you do archival work with vulnerable populations ethically / without re-traumatizing the storytellers? And that wasn't directed at anyone specific, so feel free to chime in.
I mean, I can say a little bit about this just from the experiences that I've had interviewing people within the Rikers Public Memory Project and prior with the East New York Oral History Project. With the Rikers Public Memory Project, I think we found something somewhat interesting, which was like, it wasn't clear at the beginning if people would want to talk about their experiences of Rikers, and then it seemed like they really did. And I think that it maybe stemmed from having been so silenced during their incarceration. And so, like people are not believed and dismissed and everything else when they're incarcerated. And so that was sort of interesting to note, but then, sort of building in a plan for aftercare to check in with people and understand like how it affected them to tell that story. And I think that within the process of the interviews, it may seem simple, but just to have as few questions as possible and to make them very open so that people can really drive the conversation. It's not where we don't have to collect a certain set of information. We're there to, to hear what they want to share and to sometimes prompt them a little bit with, some things that may spark a memory or something that they wanted to speak on. So that's been my experience of it, and I'm really interested to hear from Gabriel and Andrea.
I can just quickly add that we've learned a lot over the years of doing this work, made a lot of mistakes over the years and learned from those mistakes. And my colleagues have also put a lot of thought into how we're constantly evolving our own practices to try to be as ethical and responsible and inclusive and participatory as possible. And there's always, of course, the risk of emotional distress. I mean, I think that's always going to happen when someone's talking about a loss to violence. There's always the risk of re-traumatization, of course, and there are really great resources out in the oral history and archives world on how to sort of mitigate that. And we've tried to put those into practice in our own work as well. I would add to that in terms of harm, in addition to re-traumatization, is something that we also talk quite a bit about at TAVP, which is the risk of legal exposure for people or retaliation from the state. And that's something that I'm really terrified. I don't lose sleep over that many things, but I mean, actually, maybe I do in this world that we're living in. But that's something I actually worry about a lot with the people that we work with, because they're entrusting us. And so we really try to think through just trying to be as careful as we can, and really not just the state, but even like right-wing extremists online harassing people I've seen, or prison guards harassing the loved ones of people who decide to share their story publicly. So there's, I think, just trying to really be mindful about that and really trying to think through the risks and trying to be as careful and as thoughtful as we can. And again, that goes back to what I was saying before about this constantly having to balance that urge we have to document these stories, these injustices right now as much as we can, but also recognizing that we can do some harm in the process if we're not careful.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to sort of knock on everything both of you said, and just also on the having made many mistakes and learned from them, and that those mistakes come at costs to individuals. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's and the things that I've learned a lot are about the importance of involving healing justice practitioners, like from the beginning and throughout, and not like as you don't just like come with a list of referrals that you haven't even called and tried, and just be like, call the hotline if you feel a way after this, and you don't even know if the hotline has access in multiple languages, how they answer, how they treat you if they're criminalizing in their response. Like, I think you really have to. I've learned a lot from Harriet's Apothecary and other healing justice practitioners about how to integrate healing justice throughout the process, and to start from the premise, and I've always started from this premise, is that you don't have to tell your story to be part of organizing. You never have to tell your story. I didn't tell my story for like 20 years for lots of reasons. But I think that to say to people, your analysis and or your presence, or your existence, your survival is enough for you to be part of this movement. You don't have to bleed in front of, you know, council members or the public over and over again to be part of this work. So I feel like that's essential, to just, people don't have to tell a story. And then if they do decide to do it, to really sit with them on the points that, first to say, like, what do you need? Like, what do you need? That's the first thing I want before I ask your story. And then also be prepared, once people have told their stories, to offer them what they need. Right. So if it's healing in that moment, but also if they need a lawyer, if they need ongoing counseling, if they need a safe place to be in case of retaliation, if they need, like, to anticipate those things and have those things ready. And then to also think about lots of legal ramifications. Like, I think I'm often trying to, sorry, I'm often trying to kind of intervene with people collecting stories around people who have experienced police violence, not only on potential criminal exposure, but also around impacting their ability to bring litigation later, right? And so I think people don't often think about that. They think, oh, if they've screened for criminal exposure, then people can just talk. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been in a deposition with my client in a police misconduct case where, like, something they said to the press is now, like, on the table and subject of discussion. And, you know, because they said they were wearing a red dress when they did the press conference, and in fact, there's a picture of them wearing a blue one, suddenly everything is, you know, in question as to their credibility, right? And I just think you really want to walk. I'm not saying, I'm not one of those lawyers who's like, if you've experienced police misconduct, you can't talk to anyone but me ever, right? Like, I understand people want to be part of movements and I want to support them in that, but I want them also to be protected and prepared, and to know how that might play out later, and to really sit with them and think about the best way for them to tell their story, first for their heart, second for their safety, and third for, you know, making sure they get reparations that they're owed in the best possible way. And so, you know, let's really sit and think carefully about what dress you might be wearing that day, and was there a picture, and is there a video, and can we maybe just be sure that it was whatever color it was, so it doesn't come against you later as you're, you know, giving your statement. So those are a few things, but I think really mostly being mindful of, like, how much trauma is relived in the telling and also in the collecting of the stories. Often we do participatory research and we're asking people who have experienced similar things to collect stories from people who are their peers, because that's, we don't want, you know, researchers from outside the community doing it. We maybe think of the people who are being interviewed. We don't think of the people interviewing as much. And they may say, I'm fine, I'm good, everything's fine. And then it's clear that they're not. And we have to put supports in place for that as well.
Thank you all. Another question that we got, this is in reference to Andrea, your remarks around Kamala Harris, is that you mentioned people like Kamala Harris co-opting stories and hyper-visibilizing them rather than moving towards concrete action. What else does story work require to get people to that next step? And is the onus on story workers or those who hear them?
I mean, I think the first thing you ask people too is what would you have wanted to happen differently, or what would have changed the conditions that like led to your, like what other things could you imagine, like what interventions, what things did you need that would have changed the conditions that led to whatever happened? But also, as you're collecting stories, say, what's your vision of a world where that wouldn't have happened? What would need to be in place for that not to happen to the next person? And then include that as part of the story. Right? So, you know, when I'm talking about Breonna Taylor, I'm talking about Breonna Taylor being killed by the war on drugs. And the thing that would be honoring Breonna Taylor's memory would be making a world where she'd still be here, which would be ending the war on drugs. So Kamala Harris, you know, keep her name out your mouth if you're not going to end the war on drugs. Like, I think that's kind of how I try and incorporate it in response to that.
Thank you. And then our last Q&A question that we have is, I'm curious what connections you all have seen experience between this kind of documentary story work and the more formal field of theater. So also thinking about the relation between storytelling, story work, and performance. If anyone feels called to answer that.
I can just say quickly that I think that theater has been a really powerful way of telling these stories. From The Exonerated was one way people told stories, people on death row. When I was at the Urban Justice Center, we did a theater project where young people were able to write their own play and then perform it. And then I think Theater of the Oppressed is a really great way of also imagining new ways of intervening and responding to conflict and need and harm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly too. It's just to plug a group in the East Village, Lower East Side, downtown art that did, I think probably has done multiple, but the one that I saw was a really powerful play that young people created based on oral histories about the Birmingham Children's March. And it was incredibly powerful. And it actually made me really wish, maybe I'll like put this hope out into the universe, that somebody could work on, partner with somebody who might want to do that with oral histories collected as part of the East New York Oral History Project. Because what was really interesting for me about that project is that because I spoke to people who were the ones who left, I spoke to white residents that were there and left, and then I spoke to people of color who moved in, and some people who were there throughout. Like the total collection of the interviews kind of created, if you listen to them together, puts people in conversation that were never in conversation in that moment. And so to do that, like imagining how that could be done through theater is really interesting to me.
Thank you both. And then last question, really just to kind of close this out and wrap this up, is obviously storytelling work and constantly reckoning with narratives of state violence is draining and can take an emotional toll on both like the participant and then also the person doing the interview. So I was hoping each of you could talk a little bit about how do you sustain yourself in this work, but then also what gives you hope.
I can start quickly. I've been very open about my own experiences as way back when I was much younger and doing this work, and when I didn't realize the toll that it would take on me, sitting face to face with somebody who's grieving over the loss of a loved one to violence, sometimes several times a week, sometimes we did 2 in a day, which is now looking back is something that we would never do again. So I've been very open about my own experience about that, and how that still have the impacts of that all these years later. But to me, in oral history, there's this, we talk about the intrapsychic impact between interviewer and interviewee. That same process, I think, happens with broader communities when they engage with the stories. And so I think that's part of the power of the stories. So I see we just have a few minutes left, so I want to make time for my other panelists to say, so I'll stop there.
Sarita,
I mean,
playing chicken too. Playing chicken again.
I know, I won't do that. I won't do that again. I would just say that I feel really, really inspired by our members who, organizing is fundamentally like a hopeful endeavor. And I think they have every reason in the world to just want to burn everything down and not, to go through the practice of like thinking about how we make things different and then doing it is like actually requires like so much discipline and energy, and the fact that people have the fortitude for that when they really don't have to, it would be completely justified from their experiences just to want to check out from all of that. Is really, yeah, I mean, it's just really inspiring to me. And in the interviews that we've collected through the Rikers Public Memory Project, it's so amazing how, given the vast harm that has been done to people, like their thoughts about what should happen next or what repair should look like is like almost always about the future and other people and preventing it from happening to others, like strikingly not so much about, you know, the personal repair. So I feel really inspired by that and excited to be able to support that, which doesn't mean that sometimes I don't feel really worn down and probably need to come up with some better strategies. But I'm learning that too.
Yeah, I think I would just close by saying, like, it's about acknowledging the impact on you and on community that in a way that we don't. And yeah, just making sure that we understand that this is a long, protracted struggle. Like, it feels very urgent. I can't imagine you, Gabrielle, working with people on death row. Like, that's the most urgent. And often that's what I compare myself when I'm like, well, it's not a habeas petition, so I should settle down, right? It's like, but actually, when you're actually trying to save someone's life, or hold people who are grieving it, it feels urgent and it's a long haul. And so we have to create conditions where we can tap in and out, and where we can have the future that we're fighting for include us in the present. And then I think what makes me hopeful is that more people now than ever before in my life are talking about what safety actually is, what we actually need to create it. And more people are engaged in conversations about where we put our resources and why. And more people are questioning policing and punishment as the response to every conflict, harm, and need, and are seeing how criminalization is harmful than ever before in my life. So I never thought 2020 was possible when I started this work. And I'm hopeful because of people like y'all. So I'm really grateful for this conversation. It gives me hope, and looking forward to staying connected.
Thank you, Gabrielle, Sarita, and Andrea, so much. This conversation, like you just mentioned, Andrea, this conversation also made me hopeful. And I love what Miriam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. And so I just want to say thank you all so much for your time and your reflections and just sharing your brilliance with me and then everyone who was in attendance. So I'm gonna throw it back over to Piper and Atue to close us out and talk about next steps, because there's still more programs tomorrow.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all for the panel for such engaging conversation and incredible insights and inspiring work. Thank you to our supporters for making programs like this possible. And thank you for the LP team, for all your thought and care and consideration putting this program together, and Piper behind the scenes. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll take some of what you heard and learn back to your communities and work collectively to draw a more just future. We'll be sharing the recording and transcript of this conversation with you later on. And I hope you can join us tomorrow for our opening session at 10 in the morning. COVID and confinement, archiving the pandemic in prisons and jails. We'll share the link in the chat. And we'll also invite you to follow up and stay up to date with the LP and Create Forward and our various platforms and all the amazing work that the panelists are engaged with. And so with that, I want to thank you all and have a great night.
Bye, all. Thanks again.